Look at what's happening in Europe. Look at what's happening in the UK. You've got a great country with good living standards. Things can get a lot worse if you're not careful. You know, you've been a lucky country for so far, but sometimes you need to step up and protect what you've got.
One for mum, one for dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics, and policy in plain English. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett. Across the developed world, the gap between the wealthiest and the rest of us has only grown wider. It's been devastating for the economies and societies of the United States, the UK, but the situation is deteriorating here in Australia too.
The Australian government collects more money from HECS than it does from the petroleum resource rent tax.
People buying their second, third and 10th home have rushed into the market, outbidding those who are trying to buy a home to live in.
This experience is particularly galling when we continue to hand out billions in perks to property investors in negative gearing and capital gains tax discounts.
Everybody, of course, is talking about the cost of living crisis, but let's be clear, different people are experiencing this cost of living crisis in different ways. If you're on a high income, if you've got wealth behind you, actually you're doing very, very well in the current climate.
Our guest today is economist and author of The Trading Game, Gary Stevenson. Gary came from a working class background in East London, won a trading game to land an internship at a major investment bank, then made millions betting that inequality would only get worse. He now devotes himself to explaining what is happening in the economy to help ordinary people to understand their situation and to fight back. He joined me during his speaking tour of Australia and New Zealand to talk about the housing crisis, taxing Australia's natural resources properly, and why centrist political parties risk collapse if they don't address the core issue of inequality. We pick up with Gary explaining why wealth inequality in particular is such a major issue.
So I've basically been focusing on wealth inequality since 2011, and it comes from the work that I did when I was an interest rates trader. So I studied maths and economics at the London School of Economics, 2005 till 2008. Then I got a job as a interest rates trader starting in June 2008, which you will probably recognise as just before the 2008 financial crisis. And the main role of that job is basically predicting and betting on what like base rates will be, like the RBA base rate in 1 year's time, 2 years' time. Obviously, in 2008, the majority of base rates went quite quickly to zero. And then our job became betting on when will interest rates recover. And the history is actually super interesting, right? Basically, every single year from 2008 right up until 2020, markets predicted interest rates would go up the following year. It was only in COVID when they finally decided rates would never go up, which obviously was a bad prediction. But for me, this was really fascinating, right? Because I'd studied economics at university, and then I'd gotten what is kind of the best job to get as an economist out of university. And what I saw was this incredible string of mispredictions on really what I would say is the big economic question of our time, right? Betting on when will interest rates recover was at the time basically betting when will the economy recover. And every single year, all of the sort of smart economists said next year, and they were wrong every year. And I became basically fascinated in this question of like, why are economists so bad? Why are economic predictions like so consistently wrong? And this is in the context of like the early 2010s. And the theory is low interest rates are supposed to get people spending. So really, I just wanted to understand, why don't people spend more money? That was the question. And I went out and basically asked people, and I think this one of the sort of motivating reasons why I do this work is I come from quite a poor background, and nowadays it's very rare to find anybody with a poor background in top level finance or in top level economics at elite universities. But I had access to these like ordinary people, and when I asked them, they all said, "Look, we don't spend because we don't have any more money, basically." And when you look into it, that's basically the situation, right? Especially in the early 2010s, and I think it's relevant still now in Australia. When I looked around in my sort of mid-20s, what I saw was my parents' generation, ordinary people, ordinary jobs, homeowners, wealth owners, asset owners. My generation, people with degrees, often higher than average income, they'll never be able to afford to own property. So what you see there is basically the loss of a wealth-owning middle class. I had this realization in 2011, which you might remember as being the year of the European sovereign debt crisis. And I got called in by an economist early in that year, before that crisis kicked off. And he went through the financial situation of all these big governments, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, Spain, but also the UK, the US, Japan. And what he said was all of these countries spending more than their income, going into debt, dissaving their assets. And I was really struck by the similarity of the situation of my friends and their families, which is the reason they're not spending more money is because they're losing their assets and they're going into debt. And these Western governments who losing their assets, going into debt, spending more than their income. And I realized at the time, the fundamental problem we have is that people are losing their assets. But the bigger thing was, where are the assets going? Right? It shouldn't be possible for both the private sector, ordinary families, and the public sector governments to go into debt at the same time and to their assets at the same time. Right? The debt has to be to someone, and the assets have to be owned by someone. Basically.
By someone, yeah.
Yeah. So, but obviously, I was working on this trading field. I looked around me, surrounded by millionaires. And then that's when I realized, this is what is happening. This is the fundamental problem in the post-2008 world, is basically a massive transfer of wealth, a massive transfer of assets from, what used to be a relatively wealthy asset-owning middle class, from what used to be relatively wealthy Western governments, to a small, super rich elite. And of course, once you recognize that, you should then realize that will not fix itself. Because if ordinary families can't run a balanced budget when they own their own home, but they definitely can't when they don't own their own home and they have to pay rent every year. And if governments can't run a balanced budget when they're not massively in debt, well, they definitely can't run a balanced budget when they are massively in debt and they have to pay massive amounts of interest every year. And of course, the rich, as they accumulate more and more wealth, their wealth will grow at a faster rate. So I realized straight away, basically, this is basically terminal. This will not get better. And I started to bet massively that Western economies would never recover. And that was phenomenally successful. By the end of 2011, I was Cbank's most profitable trader in the world. And I've continued to make those bets ever since, basically. So I quit that job in 2014 as somebody who had made and has continued to make millions of pounds by betting that wealth inequality will collapse living standards. And I don't think anything has happened in the intervening 15 years that has done anything but prove that right.
That's quite depressing, but as you said, very, very accurate. I mean, here in Australia, we're one of the richest countries on earth, yet we're kind of constantly told we can't afford to do things like fix our aged care system, make childcare universal, make housing affordable. So you've proposed a wealth tax in the UK. Australia really doesn't have a wealth tax or inheritance taxes. Why is taxing wealth so important to lifting the living standards of low and middle income earners?
So the main reason is the tax systems that we currently have in the UK, in Australia, across the Western world, they focus on taxing income. And when I say they focus on taxing income, they actually focus on taxing quite a specific kind of income, which is income that you get from working. So if you work for your money and you earn a lot of money, you're going to be paying 40, 50, 60%, depending on where you live. But if you make your money from being in a really, really rich family and you inherit your money, or you get your money from capital gains, or it's in a company, or it's in a trust, you will pay in most places basically zero. So I come from a poor background. I was lucky to get a very good job. I worked really hard and I made a few £1,000,000 and I paid 50% income tax on that, plus other taxes on top. At the same time, the Duke of Westminster, this British aristocrat, inherited £10 billion, more than 3,000 times what I worked for, and paid nothing. So when I say that I use this slogan, tax wealth, not work, really what you could say is tax rich people as much as poor people, because at the moment we have this tax system where if you look like me, you sound like me, you come from an ordinary background, you already pay tax. But what we've done is we've created a tax system which has basically carved out the richest people in our societies and said these people don't pay tax. And look, this is not even about fairness, right? If you do not tax the richest people, they have enormous amounts of passive income, right? Like if you have even $1 billion, and and a lot of these rich people have a lot more than that, you will get passive income of more than $1 million a week. That is how much passive income these guys will make. And this is the important point is, if you give an ordinary person a big chunk of money, they will spend most of that money. Rich people, if you give them $1 million a week, they will spend none of it. They will use all of it to buy assets because all of the things they want are already covered, already paid for. And what that does is it pushes up asset prices. It squeezes ordinary Australians out of asset ownership. It squeezes the government out of asset ownership. And what you end up with is a situation where ordinary Australians, ordinary British people can't own anything. So really, I think the question is for the Australian public, you basically have a choice. Either you tax rich people on their wealth, or you accept that your kids and grandkids will not own wealth, will not own a house. I don't think it is possible to not do either of those things. You have to do one of those things.
Yeah, I think housing is the obvious expression of inequality in Australia. As you said, rents are up. Young people are just pretty much giving up on the idea that they'll ever be able to afford to buy a house. I mean, one of the things the Australian government has put in place is like a 5% deposit scheme for first home buyers. But one of the things being floated for this year's budget is, for example, reducing the capital gains tax discount. But that's traditionally, I guess, been much harder for governments to examine. But what policies should governments be looking at if we accept that they would like to make housing cheaper and more accessible for low and middle income earners? Is something like a 5% deposit scheme going to work better, or is reducing the capital gains tax discount? What are the options that governments have here?
I mean, the first thing is the 5% deposit scheme. All that is going to do is push house prices up. I don't think anyone will be surprised to hear that. I mean, it will make, in a sense, houses more affordable for a very short period of time. Then the prices will go up. And then what you end up is your kids just have to borrow $1 million. You know what I mean? Is that what you want? Do you want your kids to borrow $1 or $2 million to buy a house?
Yeah, I mean, that's where we are, yeah.
I don't think that's going to work. I think if you want to make housing more affordable, the first thing you need to do is understand why housing is unaffordable. I think there is often a focus on the affordability of housing, which is incredibly narrow to the point of absurdity. So the first thing to say is housing unaffordability is not just a problem in Australia. It's happening across the world. It's across the world. I went on a show in London, and I said the same point, and I listed a load of cities. I said in basically every city across the world, housing is unaffordable. And the guy said, "Oh, it's not unaffordable everywhere. What about in Australia?" Is what the guy said. So I think this only sort of emphasizes the point. And the second thing to say is housing unaffordability is not just housing, right? Look at what's happened to the stock market. Look what's happened to the gold price. Look what's happened to land prices. What has happened is all global assets have become incredibly expensive and unaffordable to ordinary working people. Of course, the most visible of those is housing, so we see housing. But you need to recognize this is not just an Australian problem. This is a global problem of all assets. I'm quite frustrated in traveling all around the world and having every single person in every city in the whole world tell me that global housing is unaffordable because of their local mayor. This is a big picture problem, and it's being caused by the simple fact that we have created a super rich, super wealthy class who can buy everything. And they can, these guys can only live in 5 or 6 houses, but they can own 1,000, and they can own the mortgages on 10,000. These guys are pushing the prices up. So I think if you want to make housing more affordable, you need to focus really explicitly on taxes that hit the very rich. And look, reducing the capital gains discount, it is not a bad policy, but it probably won't target the very rich for the simple reason that even if you tax capital gains at a higher rate, at the moment we tax capital gains at point of sale. And, if I've got £1 million a week passive income, how often do I have to sell anything?
Yeah.
This is the thing. Rich people never have to sell. So you can reduce the discount all you like. It's not going to hit the richest people because they will never sell. So I think this is why I focus on a wealth tax, and I think things like inheritance taxes on very large fortunes should be in the debate as well. But the problem you have is if we come into this argument with a narrow focus on how to raise money that does not include an explicit attempt to target the very rich, you will always end up falling on the upper middle because they can't defend themselves in the way the super rich can. So, and that's what you're seeing, right? But because it's harder to tax the super rich, and the super rich have more political power, they have more media power, if we don't have an explicit focus on the very rich, all of our policies will end up hitting the upper middle. And reducing the capital gains discount is not in and of itself a bad policy, but somebody needs to look at that and say, will that hit the billionaires? Because I think, unfortunately, it won't.
The resources underneath the country belong to the people of the country.
Consider the fact that in Norway, they tax the fossil fuel industry and they give university education to their kids for free. In Australia, we subsidise the fossil fuel industry and we charge our kids a fortune to go to uni.
The ACTU have put up a proposal to put a 25% tax on the revenue that these multinational gas corporations are getting when they sell our gas overseas. And what that would do is provide a huge disincentive for them to sell our gas to the global spot market and an incentive to provide it to Australians instead.
And I want to show you this. It's from the Australia Institute. They commissioned Redbridge to do a poll on this amongst various voters. The biggest support, the strongest support for this flat 25% tax on gas exports is the Greens voters there. But next is One Nation voters. They like this idea a lot.
Well, speaking of wealth, I think one of the biggest sources of collective wealth in Australia is our natural resources. We've got huge reserves of coal, gas, iron ore, one of the largest exporters of LNG in the world. Yet Australia Institute research shows that the Commonwealth Government collects more money from taxing beer than it does from our petroleum resources rent tax, for example, the tax on the gas industry, export industry, super profits. I mean, if we're talking about taxing wealth and the very wealthiest, does that kind of thing surprise you that, we're collecting more money from beer drinkers in Australia than we are from our gas export tax?
I mean, it doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me because this is the story all over the world where the very rich manage to avoid it and the people in the middle, those people paying that beer tax, it's overwhelmingly not super, super rich people, but the people who run and own and profit from these natural resource industries, in many cases will include a lot of very rich people, and they'll have a lot of political power and they'll fight to protect themselves. And I think the Australian public should fight to protect themselves as well. Listen, I was excited to come to Australia because you'll be aware I fight this fight a lot in the UK. And the main argument we get back is, if you tax them, they'll leave. If you tax them, they'll leave. If you tax them, they'll leave. And, the UK is a small trading country and, we need to be open to the world. Australia, more than any other country, has this enormous amount of wealth, which is overwhelmingly either built on and attached to or lying underneath the ground. There is no country I can think of on earth that has a better shot at taxing its billionaires because these guys can't take the iron ore with them. You know what I mean? Australia's wealth is overwhelmingly property and natural resources. And this is all stuff which cannot be taken away from Australia. The rich cannot take them away unless, of course, you let them dig it up, take it away, and you don't make them pay for that. So I think you've got this phenomenal wealth of natural resources. And that is one of the big reasons why Australia still does have, and has had for a long time, some of the best living standards in the world for ordinary workers. But, I would really caution you and caution Australians to look outside at other countries in the world that have enormous amount of natural resource wealth and see that it doesn't inevitably lead to phenomenally high living standards for ordinary people. Obviously, you've got this example of Norway in Europe, which had a lot of natural resources, still has natural resources. It did sell them off, but it kept the wealth and built a sovereign wealth fund. But, we could look at 10 countries, 10 of the most resource-rich countries in the world that end up being run by a corrupt elite surrounded by poverty. Look at Venezuela, look at Democratic Republic of Congo, the list goes on and on and on. Having an enormous amount of natural resources does not necessarily give you great living conditions. The reason it has done that in Australia is because you've managed the distribution and you've protected your share of the pie for ordinary people. I think you should be very, very careful about selling off those natural resources. The key thing is, where does the wealth go? Who benefits? If you do not protect in the way that Norway did that wealth for ordinary people, then you will lose it. I mean, the UK also found North Sea oil. It didn't build a sovereign wealth fund. It didn't protect that wealth for the people. And now I'm coming to you today from a country where half the people in the winter cannot simultaneously feed their kids and turn the heating on. So I think you would need to be really, really careful about managing and protecting that wealth for the Australian people.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about is, I guess, politics, because obviously to make any kind of policy change, you're going to come up against the people who are benefiting from the current system. How have you experienced that pushback in the UK when you're doing this kind of work, and how do you address that? How do you build the power to change things?
The political situation for me has been and is really frustrating because we have a really, really big social media presence now and really, really overwhelming support with the public. The campaign has just been phenomenally successful. Wealth taxes are incredibly popular, even amongst the majority of Reform voters, Conservative voters. That's our far right and centre right party. It's phenomenally popular with the public, even people on the right. And yet most of the time I did this work was under a Conservative centre-right government that I didn't really expect anything from. We've had a Labour government for a year and a half now, a bit more than a year and a half, centre-left government. And you might expect, they need money quite desperately. You might expect that they would be willing to come and talk to me and consider these proposals. But basically, they have really quite aggressively frozen me out. I've been making this documentary the last few months. They've refused to send anybody from Treasury, anybody from Frontbench to talk to it. And it's kind of baffling, right? Because they're phenomenally unpopular. They've got no presence on social media. They're desperately in need of money. And yet they will not talk to me. And it's honestly quite baffling as to why, to be honest. Because it would seem like I'd be the obvious person to help with their popularity, the social media, their need for money. It's been phenomenally frustrating. I've had a better reception actually since I've been here. I've had tons of politicians reaching out, trying to meet up and trying to, so many that I haven't even been able to meet. There's too many really for me to meet them. But it is frustrating. But look, if we don't deal with top 1% inequality, living standards will continue to fall. And living standards have fallen a long way in the UK now, and in Europe. And if that continues, these centrist political parties, be they centre-right or centre-left, they will disappear. They will die because it is becoming increasingly clear to men and women on the street that this economic status quo is not delivering and is not going to deliver. And not only are things not getting better, but things are getting actively worse. So, I think the Labour Party in the UK, who are the party of government, either they do something about this or they die, unfortunately. And I think, Australia is a little bit behind on this. Living standards have not fallen as much. I think you're basically you're going in the same direction, but you're not so far down the slope. But the same thing will happen to the Labour Party here if they don't deal with top-level inequality. Living standards will continue to fall. You'll have growing problems of poverty, and they will fall to challenges from most obviously the far right. But, people want something new. People want something new. And, I'm open. I'm very, very open to talking to the Labour Party in the UK. We've had so many messages from Australian politicians while I've been here. We probably have been contacted by Labour. I would try to meet them, but I'm obviously running around doing this tour. But I would encourage politicians of centrist political parties on the centre left and on the centre right, be a little bit more open-minded to what needs to be done about the economy. Because I think they're stuck in what we call in the UK the Westminster bubble, where they think everything's fine. And they're extreme. I think they think I'm some sort of left-wing communist extremist. I think that's what they think. But listen, I make millions of pounds betting on this. I'm one of the best traders in one of the best banks in the world. I've got one economics degree from LSE, one economics from Oxford. I think I've got a legitimate claim to say I'm pretty good at this. But, I'll keep betting on collapsing societies, and I'll keep telling them how to stop those societies from collapsing, But what I would say to the Australian public is, listen, if the government don't do it, you've got to make them do it.
I guess just following up on that, we have seen a real trend in the United States, the United Kingdom, and more recently here, I guess, a surge in far-right politics. Do you put some of that down to rising inequality? Do you think that's partly what's motivating that shift to the right?
Yeah, I personally think I don't think it's any more complicated than 20 years of falling living standards. I think it's as simple as that. I remember when Barack Obama came in. When he came in, was it 2008? Around about that sort of time, and his big slogan was hope and change, hope, change, hope, change. And what did he really deliver in terms of growing living standards for working people? And you've had, since 2008 in Europe, living standards have gotten worse, consistently. It's been rapid in the last 5 years. First it was slow, now it was fast. And people have voted in a succession of centre-right, centre-left, centre-right, centre-left. I'm old enough to remember, maybe you are too, when there was only two political parties in every European country. And it went centre-right, centre-left, centre-right, centre-left. Now most of those parties have died, right? Because people will vote for sensible hope and sensible change once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. But if it becomes really, really clear that these centrist politicians, whatever colour they are, red or blue, are consistently delivering falling living standards, then they're well within their rights to vote for something crazy, And there's a quote from Milton Friedman, the American economist, says at times of crisis, the new ideas will be chosen from the ideas lying around at the time. And I think really the far right are benefiting from simply being the most obvious alternative to a failing status quo. There was, I think he was Australian. I think it was well known here because he was Australian. There was an Australian that won gold in the Olympic ice skating because everyone else fell over. And he was
Steven Bradburys.
Yeah, Bradburys, right? That's the far right. The centre right and the centre left are so stuck in a very narrow way of thinking about the economy, which has no place for inequality, no place for taxing the very top, that they continually deliver falling living standards. And people are sick of it. And really, the far right, they've done this Bradbury, which is they are the guys who are there. And I think they will inevitably win because of the collapse of the centre unless we can build a progressive alternative. And that's what I'm trying to do here.
Yeah. Well, that was kind of where I was going to finish up. You're on your tour of Australia right now. What is the one message that you hope Australians take away from your visit while you're here?
The main thing is if you do not deal with growing top-level inequality, top level, we're not talking about bankers and lawyers, we're talking about super millionaires and billionaires, then these problems of growing poverty, falling living standards, and most obviously falling housing affordability will get worse. This will get worse. And unfortunately, in many cases, your politicians are not looking at it. They've not got their eye on the right ball here. So you need to hold their feet to the fire and demand, listen, we want you to do something about inequality, about growing wealth of the super rich, about tax avoidance and low rates of tax at the top level, or we're not going to vote for you. That's it. And the second message I will send is, look at what's happening in Europe. Look at what's happening in the UK. You've got a great country with good living standards. Things can get a lot worse if you're not careful. You've been a lucky country for so far, but sometimes you need to step up and protect what you've got.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us this week. The latest Vantage Point essay, What We Owe the Water, It's Time for a Fossil Fuel Treaty, is available now from Australia Institute Press. You can buy this edition for $19.95, and pod listeners can use the code PODVP, that's PODVP, at checkout to get free shipping. If one edition isn't enough, you can subscribe to Vantage Point as a series, and for just $64.95, you'll get 4 engaging essays every year on some of the most pressing issues facing Australia and the world. Visit australiainstitute.org.au/store or follow the link in the show notes to order now. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.